Leaving and striding through the hall, Kai watched the rain as he passed by the window. Shaking his head in awe of her talent, he hoped she'd enjoyed her bath and wasn't worrying too much about the bonding ceremony. Striding up the stairs, 2 at a time, he hurried to the landing. He'd never felt so relaxed and at ease, and was eager to see her, having enjoyed the short time he'd spent with her that morning. Passing Nissa's room and continuing to Eloise's, he heard Roulon yelling. Looking inside, he was confronted with a scene that enraged him. Roulon was shaking Eloise and shouting at her, and within half a second, Kai was in the room. "Get your hands off her!" he bellowed, making everyone turn. Roulon instantly released Eloise, and Kai grabbed hold of him by his throat, shoving him backwards until Roulon's body collided with the wall. Growling like a rabid dog and with wild eyes, Kai pinned him to the cold stone, raising him off the floor. Roulon's feet dangled, and he tried to wriggle free while he clawed at Kai's hand around his throat. He couldn't make a sound other than a pathetic whine. Both Nissa and Eloise watched in horror as Kai's hand squeezed tighter around Roulon's neck, choking him slowly. It took both of them a few moments to take in what had happened before Eloise came around. "Get Leon! Go!" Eloise pushed Nissa towards the door. Turning quickly to watch her brother fight for his life, Eloise didn't know how to help him, watching in horror as he clawed at Kai's strong hand around his throat. Roulon's eyes bulged as he gasped for air. "Kai, please, stop!" Eloise approached Kai from behind and desperately grabbed at his arm with her small hands, trying to pull him off her brother. But too strong, and seemingly in a trance-like state, Kai continued to hold Roulon against the wall, relentlessly increasing the pressure on his throat. Roulon's eyes rolled back when his terrified body trembled as he felt the life draining out of him. Distressed, and realizing her attempts to pull at Kai's arm had no effect, she moved around to his other side and squeezed herself between him and her brother. Pressing her hand against his cheek, she tried to pull his gaze toward hers. "Kai, please, look at me! Kai!" There was a moment of silence. Roulon stopped gasping, and Eloise stared at Kai when his face turned, and wild, fiery eyes burned into her. Her eyes focused onto his mouth, distorted teeth, elongated and sharp like nothing she'd ever seen, showed. She gasped, unable to turn her gaze away. Leon and Nissa raced into the room and confronted with the scene. Leon drew his sword. "Let him be!" His voice thundered, but it wasn't his command that made Kai release Roulon. Kai let him fall to the floor in a heap, barely breathing. Eloise fell against the wall in disbelief. Gone was the beautiful face she'd admired and stared at only a few hours earlier, replaced with something inhuman for a brief moment. She closed her eyes and tried to hold on to the image, but it was gone. Shaking and trembling with fear, she couldn't explain what she'd seen. In 2 days she'll be married to that. Her eyes swelled with tears. Towering over her and breathing hard, Kai leaned his hands on the wall either side of her head. Staring into her teary eyes and seeing her shake with fear, he lowered his head in shame. Their mourning together had been perfect. She'd lost her fear of him and started to see his gentler side, but now he worried she'd only remember this moment. Unable to control his rage at seeing Roulon treat her so badly, he'd let the anger out. Now, calm and relaxed, he quickly turned to her brother on the floor. Nissa aided Roulon to his feet and supported him as they left to find his room. He choked and coughed while rubbing his neck, unable to speak. Standing ready by Eloise's side, Leon pointed his sword towards Kai. He had no doubt he'd die if Kai attacked him, but fearing only for Eloise, he stood his ground. "Move away from Eloise." His voice remained calm. He didn't want to provoke Kai further, but his duty was towards Eloise. Pressed against the wall and breathing hard, she was terrified. Leon wanted Kai to back away, and didn't want to use his sword unless forced. Slowly casting his gaze to Leon, supported by his powerful arms as he leaned against the wall, Kai stared at him. He was equally calm when he spoke. "I'd never hurt Eloise." Kai narrowed his eyes at Leon. "Put your sword away before you get hurt." Turning to look back to Eloise, Kai pulled his hands away from the wall and stepped back. He'd only wanted to protect her, but the look on her face when she saw who he was remained in his memory. With a quiet voice he broke the silence. "Forgive me. I don't like the way your brother treats you." She'd been exposed to the secret he'd kept hidden his entire life, and he wished she'd not had to learn about it this way. Seeing the sadness and regret that filled his eyes, Eloise looked up to Kai, still in shock. His angelic face had lured her in. She'd started to fall for him, bewitched by seductive eyes and perfect lips. Eloise took her time to examine his features. The man she'd seen this morning was standing before her, but what she'd just witnessed a moment ago was not. But staring up at the lost soul, Eloise couldn't reject his need for love. All her life she'd strived for attention from her father, but he could barely look at her most days. Questioning if fate had brought her and Kai together, like two broken halves of a once whole being, she felt this was where she wanted to be. Turning to face Leon, Eloise smiled. "You can leave us, Leon, please." Leon's brows furrowed. "I think I should stay, my lady." Casting a concerned glance towards Kai, then back to Eloise, he didn't move. "Please, Leon, go and tend to my brother. Everything is fine here." Brushing her soft fingertips across Kai's cheek, Eloise showed him she wasn't afraid. Kai closed his eyes in relief and, taking her hand, leaned close and rested his head against hers. "I promise I'll never hurt you, Eloise." Softly spoken words of a promise filled Eloise's ears. Brushing her lips across his warm skin and trusting his words, she placed a free hand around his neck and, sliding it under his hair, she pulled him closer to whisper against his lips, "I know." Kai smoothed his arms around her slender waist and pulled her close, raising her off the floor as he nestled his face in the crook of her neck. She smelled of honeysuckle and sweet almonds as he took deep breaths, letting her scent fill his nostrils. "Thank you," he rasped. Husky words fell into Eloise's ear, making her tighten her hold around his neck. Watching in amazement, Leon couldn't understand the exchange between them. Sheathing his sword, he moved to leave the room, but waited outside, just in case he was needed. Hearing Roulon's whining from his room, he didn't need to be concerned for him. Nissa was there, and he was sure he'd prefer her to comfort him, so he remained where he was. Releasing Eloise and stepping back, Kai lowered his head. Finding it hard to look at her, his eyes avoided hers. He'd never been able to control the rage inside him once it started. Usually Sabe or Kira would just leave him alone and let it run its course. But Eloise did something no one else had ever tried to do. She'd stayed with him and brought him back from the dark place he went once the demon inside took over. She appeared terrified, but it didn't stop her from calling, touching.